BBC boss exits, trans activists cheer, free speech weeps. June Sarpong, who served as the BBC's Director of Creative Diversity until early 2024, departed the broadcaster after years of controversial diversity initiatives that critics argue prioritized identity politics over editorial independence. While the BBC maintains her exit was a mutual decision related to restructuring, internal sources and media observers point to sustained pressure from activist groups on both sides of the cultural divide. Trans rights activists celebrated her departure, claiming she didn't go far enough in enforcing inclusive language policies. Meanwhile, media freedom advocates argue her tenure exemplified how institutional fear of activist backlash corrupts editorial judgment. The Sarpong case illuminates a paradox poisoning public discourse in 2026. People who position themselves as champions of marginalized communities often prove most hostile to disagreement, while those preaching tolerance exhibit remarkable intolerance toward dissent. Comedy has become the last refuge for uncomfortable truths, precisely because humor provides plausible deniability. Comedians like Ricky Gervais, Dave Chappelle, and Graham Linehan have faced career-threatening backlash for jokes touching transgender issues, yet their work thrives because audiences hunger for someone willing to say the emperor has no clothes. When serious critique gets labeled transphobic hate speech, satire becomes the pressure valve. This isn't about trans people deserving mockery or discrimination. It's about the intellectual dishonesty of declaring entire topics off limits to scrutiny. Gender identity ideology rests on specific philosophical claims about the relationship between biology, psychology, and social construction. These claims are contestable. Saying trans women are women without qualification requires accepting that womanhood is purely a matter of self-identification, that biological sex is irrelevant to social categories, and that anyone questioning this framework is engaging in literal violence. These are extraordinary assertions requiring extraordinary evidence, yet dissent gets treated as moral depravity rather than legitimate disagreement. The social construction argument cuts both ways, and activists rarely acknowledge the contradiction. Yes, many gender norms are culturally constructed. Feminine and masculine stereotypes vary across societies and eras. But the solution to oppressive stereotypes isn't declaring that gender identity is entirely self-defined, while simultaneously insisting that misgendering causes genuine harm. If gender is purely a social construct with no objective reality, why does using the wrong pronoun constitute an act of violence? If gender identity is a deep, innate, immutable characteristic demanding legal protection, doesn't that undermine the claim that it's socially constructed? You can't simultaneously argue that gender is meaningless and that gender identity is the most meaningful aspect of human existence. Words require stable meanings for communication to function. When activists redefine woman to include anyone who identifies as a woman, they're not expanding the category, they're destroying its ability to reference biological reality. This matters for women's sports, where male puberty confers permanent physiological advantages. It matters for women's prisons, where housing intact male offenders with female inmates creates safety risks. It matters for healthcare, where biological sex determines disease risk and treatment protocols. Pretending these concerns are rooted in bigotry rather than material reality is gaslighting on an institutional scale. The BBC case demonstrates how organizations become captured by ideological movements. When a major broadcaster employs a director of creative diversity whose job is ensuring content meets activist-approved standards, editorial independence dies. When writers, producers, and journalists know that certain perspectives will trigger HR investigations and social media pile-ons, self-censorship becomes endemic. The result isn't inclusive programming that reflects diverse perspectives. It's sanitized propaganda that treats adults like children who can't handle disagreement. Audiences notice, trust erodes, and the institution hemorrhages credibility. Criticism isn't violence. Disagreement isn't hate. Comedy isn't literal. These should be uncontroversial statements, yet they've become acts of defiance. The people most loudly demanding society listen to them prove most unwilling to hear objections. If your ideology can't withstand scrutiny, mockery, or dissent without demanding institutional punishment for doubters, maybe the problem isn't the critics. Maybe it's the ideology.